Welcome to the final session of the Epi Twitter Book Club about epidemiology and the people's health. So today we have Nancy Krieger here to tell us about the book and answer some questions. Do you want to give a little short introduction of yourself and why you decided to write the book?
Sure. So hello to everybody. I'm really delighted that, Ellie, that you've taken the initiative with others to get this Twitter book club going. I think it's a great service. So thank you very much for including me. The book, as I mentioned when I was here last time, midway through the book, is something that came out of my own curiosity, what I wanted to know that I wish I had been taught. And it was about wanting to understand the theories behind the kinds of questions that epidemiologists pose, which is a different question than the kinds of theories we use to design studies, to understand statistics, and many other kinds of theory that feed into the kind of work we do. This is fundamentally about the theories about what explains the people's health, the who and what behind that. So I did lots of reading based on my own background and interest in history and philosophy of science, as well as other biology, et cetera. And then I started teaching, and then out of teaching, I eventually got to a point where I could write the book. And the book now forms the core of what I continue to teach. And I continue to read actively in all the areas and write actively in the very different topics that are covered. And I'm glad to be able to contribute one small piece, which is about helping to get clarity about the range of options of theories that people have used, sometimes conscious of it, sometimes not, as per famous quotes about, do we all speak prose or poetry, consciously or not? And so that's the origins behind it. And I don't expect everyone to agree with the kinds of positions I take on kinds of research that I do. But what I do hope is that everyone gets clarity for understanding why there is a need for precision about the theories that are used, epidemiologic theories of disease distribution, which are not just about mechanism, and also how you use those in concert with the other kinds of theories that are needed. There are theories, again, that are about statistical theory. There are theories about research design. How do you do that? There are theories around causal inference. Those are none of them, they contribute to understanding the distribution of health in human societies and also in relation to the other species with which we co-inhabit this planet. But they're not the same as those kinds of theories. So this is, again, specifically about theories of disease distribution. And I think for me, a very telling change of thinking that happened was that I can document that one to the mid-90s was not only besides coming up with the ecosocial theory of disease distribution, which I've been continuing to elaborate since I first articulated in 1994, but realize that it was a theory of disease distribution, not, as I initially thought, a theory of disease causation. Causal mechanisms are one thing, but explaining disease distributions requires more than just understanding mechanisms, and that should come across. And I hope that out of this discussion that people realize, as practicing not only epidemiologists, but anybody that's in public health, that there's a need to have clarity and precision about the theories that we are using, as well as the methods that we are using and the metrics that we are using. And all of those are theoretically informed, but what happens, I think, a lot in public health and particularly in epidemiology courses is you get the methods and the metrics, but you don't get the theories of disease distribution being taught. And that's not just a quote unquote social science question. That's actually a question that fundamentally relies on epidemiologic knowledge, which unites biology and the fact that we live in societies. So that's the standpoint that I come from, with a deep curiosity about both and a commitment above all to health equity.
Thanks. So I think one of the questions that kind of came up a couple times in the book club discussions and on Twitter was around this idea of sort of what got you motivated to write the book. And related to that, several people kind of asked the question of the title of the book is Epidemiology and the People's Health. And there was some discussion about whether that choice of people's health rather than population health or the public health, whether what was the meaning behind that, and what was sort of the implication that you were trying to get us to think about by choosing that language?
So who are the people? And the calls for the people comes out of a long social justice tradition, and it's in that spirit. And it's the same reason why the new book series that I'm editing for Oxford University Press on small books with big ideas for population health. The first book that was out was Political Sociology and the People's Health. The second one is Climate Change and the People's Health. Those are published. The third one that's en route that Sharon Schwartz is taking the lead on writing is causal inference in the people's health. So the emphasis, and then there's a few others, and there's one that's in process and epigenetics in the people's health. So, and then I've just gotten a book contract approved. I'm actually very happy about this, an embodiment in the people's health, and I'll start on that like next year sometime, starting to write that. And so the idea behind the people's health is it has a long history around calls for social justice in the people's health. And that's the reason why. And people are always part of populations. There can be all kinds of definitions of populations, and I've written on that very specifically. But to say the people's health means something about the polity, it means something about the people, and for me, it means a commitment to equity.
Yeah, I think that was sort of what the sense was in our discussion, that was probably, an intentional to sort of highlight the idea of equity and social justice. So you mentioned the eco-social theory, and for me, that chapter was like totally resonated with me. My undergrad was biology, and it was mostly on ecology, and I kind of realized reading that chapter that this is sort of what I had been bringing to the table as my background and thinking about public health before, but I'd never really seen it sort of laid out or thought about it that way. So I thought that was really, really important and useful and informative chapter for me. I really liked it. And one of the questions that came up in the book club related to that is, I guess, maybe two questions. So first, is this sort of where you think that epi theory is at and should go, is with you presented a lot of different theories in the book and sort of the evolution of theories, and the eco-social theory is a little bit sort of the capstone of the book, but is that sort of where you think epi should go, and that's like the main theory you think people should be using, or is that sort of one of many, and what are kind of things people should think about if they're trying to understand how they should sort of choose a theory for their research?
So first, I'm glad that it resonated with you, and I'm glad that you picked up on the fundamental ecological and biological underpinnings of eco-social theory of disease distribution, takes evolutionary history really seriously, among other things, and that's got to be part of how we understand the utter complexity, quirkiness, and beauty, as well as potential destructiveness of biological phenomena. So I think that that's really important that we bring that to the table, but that's happening always again in real populations, human and otherwise, living in real places in real times, and that's like fundamental to understanding disease distributions and how they change. And the change in disease distributions is part of where both the optimism and pessimism can come. We can watch some diseases on the resurgence that shouldn't be because of very bad post-social policies. And we can also watch some diseases on the decline, which are really good and are both because of conscious public health intervention and also the ways that things are way more complex than what any alleged one well-defined intervention can do, which is another set of comments to the side that get to the causal inference debates. So I think that for me, yes, I'm interested in continuing to deepen eco-social theory of disease distribution, and I do suggest that it could be of great utility to epidemiologists to sit down and work with it and use it as a mental checklist. Again, as I noted in the very beginning of the book, theory, the root of that means to see is inner vision. That's the etymologic root of the word. And it's to give you, like you're saying, yes, you had a lot of ideas that were floating around, but you can actually anchor those ideas in a theory and then push yourself. So when I do a study, I sit down with my little checklist of key constructs of eco-social theory, and how am I applying them in my study? Check, 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 check. What's missing? Oops, let me go back and rethink this. Theory should give you that. It should give you not a simplistic mental toolkit, but it is a mental toolkit, just like methods are part of the toolkit. But the theoretical framing is huge. Now, theories can exist, and people will say that they exist at multiple levels. You can have macro, meso, and micro theories. So you're going to be drawing on different kinds of theories for different bits. I do work, again, on breast cancer. I'm going to be looking at some of the theories that are out there in cancer about cancer pathology, and that's fine. That comes from a very different line, but I'm going to be integrating that with a frame towards understanding population distributions and which distributions. And particularly for me, I bring a very strong health equity focus to what I do. So that's always going to motivate the questions. So I would argue strongly for the eco-social theory of disease distribution, but that's going to draw on, and as I said, it's complementary to and relates to other kinds like political economy of health, for example. That's really crucial. And there are theories that I would draw on that are social science and political theories that help inform, again, the kinds of questions raised. But I'll bring with eco-social theory a biological edge to that, which is really important in terms of basic things like etiologic period. which is often a surprise to many people that are coming from a more social science standpoint, like, oops, how would you expect to see an effect and when and where and all that? How do you integrate that? So for me, it's a very integrative theory, and it's complementary to, but it's also in contradiction to biomedical and lifestyle. And those are ones that I think epidemiologists would do. I mean, it's one thing if you're going to test a drug for clinical effectiveness, and I'm all in favor of that. I just got my flu shot yesterday. I was really glad to see the signs in CVS, and I'm very happy I got my flu shot. And I'm very glad for the very particular kinds of research that go into me getting a flu shot and having the flu vaccine widely available. That's wonderful. That's a piece of the picture. It's not the entire picture. And the questions that epidemiologists focus on go beyond those of clinical medicine. But again, as someone who potentially could be and has been a patient in the past, I'm very glad that there's clinical research. That's critical. But Epi has a different job and a related job. And it's understanding that I think gets lost in the translation, especially when most of the funding for NIH research and others goes in the biomedical vein and not actually to public health. So this is just about a corrective. It's not saying we don't need clinical research, because obviously we do, but it's also saying that's not the same as public health research or epidemiologic research by itself, ipso facto.
Yeah. So the funding point raises kind of another follow-up question that was discussed a lot here, is the idea of, how do we fund the development of theory in epi? And one of the things kind of related to that I would ask is, so in talking with some sociologists about epi theory, some of the pushback I got was like, oh, you don't want to go too far down the theory road. Like in sociology, everyone has their own theory, and there's just too much theory, and why would you need more theory? And I think, I'm convinced by the book that in epi we definitely need more theory, and it seems to me that probably what we need is people who are sort of thinking deeply about that for a lot of time, developing theories. But how do those people kind of make a go of it in the current climate?
So 2 comments on that. One, I don't know that epidemiology actually needs, quote unquote, more theories of disease distribution. What I think is it needs people consciously working with the ones that exist and pushing on them and seeing what can be refuted, what can be supported, what can be worked with. So I think that there's actually a wide variety of options out there, and that there are a lot of people, even using theory as in lifestyle and biomedical, but never say it. They just are using it, but they're not talking about it. And they're not therefore dealing with what the actual restrictive assumptions are. So I think actually the bigger challenge for the discipline right now is using the theories that currently exist as theories of disease distribution, not again narrow mechanisms, but theories of disease distribution, and having what's true in the social sciences is you will see people often at great length. Mostly their introductions are like the size of 3 epi papers. But so they're very, I have a joke a lot with one of my sociology friends about that. I mean, our papers are like, they're not having gotten to clearing their throat yet, an epi paper. But so given those different disciplinary conventions, which are huge, right, and important to be aware of, is that the first thing that is that they always say a lot in their intros about what theories they're using, and then eventually motivate the specific hypotheses. I think within the terseness even of the format of most epi articles, it is possible in the intro to say one sentence, if not paragraph, of using this theory and then having a table somewhere or a supplementary thing that explains how you're applying the constructs of that theory to motivate the specific research questions that you're asking. So I think that the first corrective should be not just development of more theories of disease distribution, because I think there's a good array out there, but rather conscious application of the ones that do exist, and every study saying, hello, this is the theory of disease distribution I'm using, or the theories of disease distribution, I'm taking bits and pieces because I find that useful, and this is how I'm thinking about it, and not framing it narrowly in terms of a quote-unquote DAG. Because part of the thing is that with the DAG is you're saying, what are the unobserved variables? Well, how do you even think about what the unobserved variables are if you don't have a theory of disease distribution to give you that guidance? And if you're not aware of and are critical about the literature that's informing that. So the DAG may finally get you to where you're doing modeling and making you think better about the specific models given the specific variables you have, but it's not itself the theory. that's going to come from the broader theory of disease distribution that's guiding the selection of variables and saying, and especially if you ever want to make the claim that there's no unmeasured confounding, it's like A, good luck, and B, what could it be, and how do you think about that systematically? So for my own work, I will draw a conceptual model first, which is not as restrictive as a DAG, and that's going to come later when you get to the point of actually modeling things. But and having a dialogue between those two is really important. So I just want to flag that as what the relationship is. It's not an either or, it's probably a both and. But if you don't do the first one of the kinds of the theories of disease distribution that I'm talking about that frame the specific hypotheses that will be tested, and every study, of course, only frames a narrow, works on and tests a narrow empirical study, a narrow set of hypotheses that come from a larger body that are supported by a theory, but to be mindful of what you might be trying to refute as well as what you're trying to support. And so that's what I think would be better than trying to say that they're supposed to be developing more. I think that people need to be, who are epidemiologists, much more assiduous and explicit about using the existing theories and figuring out how they're going to work with that and doing exercises about how they're going to apply them. The follow-up course that I teach, the first course I teach in Fall 1 is based predominantly on this book with supplementary readings. In Fall 2, I have an advanced seminar. And the paper that I assign people to write is to compare 2 review articles on the quote-unquote same topic. For example, let's just say tuberculosis in the United States. First paper has to look, but they have to specify where in the world. It could be global. It could be, somewhere in South Africa, it could be in Thailand. It could be wherever, but it has to give a geographic place. It's not just in general, or it could be global. And then it has to give a time period. The first article has to be between 1900 and 1950, and the second article needs to be 1980 till now. And they have to dissect each article about what were the theories of disease distribution that informed the review. What do you think? Typically, the author doesn't say. So how do you piece that together from what kinds of evidence are presented and what are not? How do you look around the article to understand what the repertoire of ideas and evidence were at the time? That gives you a very critical understanding of how the knowledge that was seen au courant as like the cutting edge of its time was framed by its times, what the omissions and gaps are that one can see now, what that might mean for research going forward. So that gets the students to very consciously apply the theories of disease distribution that they've learned by trying to figure out what might have motivated these 2 different review articles. And these are not meant to be like choices of bad review articles. They're meant to be good review articles that people can find and think more critically. And a review article really gives you a deeper understanding than any one article does, because you're asked to think, what is guiding the thought processes of the team or person that wrote the review to critically evaluate the literature? And are there entire blind spots? What's motivating that blindness to the information that actually is out there versus what does the review actually help pose as saying, whoops, we don't know anything about X, Y, and Z, and who's the we, by the way, in that sentence that doesn't know that, and why is that? So that's what my suggestion is. It's much more at this point, I think, about the conscious application, testing, and use of theories of disease distribution explicitly that would, I think, ratchet up and improve the quality of the work. And the whole point is to do better science. And that's the objective here. And then to understand where epidemiologic studies as such can help inform and be engaged with larger questions of the times about what can be done by whom to improve the public's health and the people's health, and particularly in reduce health inequities.
So one of the things you mentioned is that when you're doing a study, you kind of have a checklist to sort of think about how that works with the ecosocial theory. Is that like an actual checklist that's
Yes, that's scribbled in my very little handwriting. And so I work through constructs of embodiment, and I work through the different things that I'm thinking about. And I go through that diagram that people have noted in chapter 7, and I just how am I thinking about that for each one? And I can tell you.
And
so it really is a mental checklist.
Okay. And I guess sort of related to that, is there maybe one of your papers or someone else's papers that you think is kind of a really good example that people should we could read as a follow-up that sort of gives how to present this in a paper, how to link the theory and the methods? I don't want to put you on the spot. You can think about it later and send it too.
That's tricky because there are ones that I write out that are the conceptual papers. There was one that goes through this, for example, which is, thinking about, using the example of breast cancer estrogen receptor status, about how you work in different kinds of history, from individual life course and the history of the tumor to evolutionary history, to bring that into what the research questions are. But that's not an empirical study. And then for the empirical studies, because of the brevity of epidemiologic papers, usually there's not great length of exposition, but there is a little in that. And so it's hard to, I can think more about which papers I've done, because there's like a lot of different ones to think about, which would give you what you're talking about. I do not have paper. I have papers in which I show like the diagrams of, for example, ecosocial theory of disease distribution as applies to understanding racism and health. But again, but the paper's usually given limits of N of tables and whatnot. I mean, what you're making me think is I might, for some future papers, do that as a supplementary like table or some, supplementary figure and table to work that in a little bit more explicitly to address your concerns. But usually I sort of separate the conceptual papers from the empirical, because again, of the conventions of our discipline of the N of words and tables and figures permitted. So that's what I would say to that.
So I think I have sort of two more questions, and then maybe we'll open it up to the audience. We've been discussing a lot on Twitter lately is sort of the ethical issues around the sort of stigmatizing impact of certain research questions. And so one that was sort of really big, or two that were kind of really big on Twitter recently, is a 2013 study on whether women with endometriosis are more attractive than women without endometriosis, which the authors argued was a sort of backdoor way to identifying whether or not there might be a genetic basis for endometriosis. And this, your face is exactly how we all, it was kind of a shocking study, really. They even say explicitly that they didn't tell women the purpose of the study because in the informed consent, because they didn't want women to like try to appear more attractive to the raters who rated them, and it
sounds like an IRB was also negligent.
Yeah. And then a sort of another related study that just came out was this big GWAS study looking for, quote unquote, gay gene.
Yeah, there's an excellent critique of that study that just was published in a blog that I just posted to the 1848 listserv this morning. Yes, from the epidemiologist at Emory.
Yes.
And yes, these are very controversial, important questions. And epidemiologic studies will be one piece of that, and how will be robust debate, and there ought to be.
So I guess I'm kind of one of the sort of,
but
like, it seems like with the GWAS, they sort of did this, they incorporated the community and whatever, and they sort of tried to frame asking the question in as best a way they could, but they didn't seem like they stopped and asked whether the question really even was appropriate to ask. So
I have not read the study in great depth, so therefore I know better than to try to critique it, having not read it. So I will stop there. I will flag the one thing that, however, that I have seen consistently as raised about questions is the definition that was used for quote unquote gay, which was, have you ever had sex with someone of the same sex? And that's tricky. Because, one, you got a lot of people where they may have had a one-time encounter, and ever is not the same as multiple times, and certainly never the same as identity. Because what's clearly in the literature, and this I do know, and I'm doing work on LGBTQ discrimination right now and health, among others, is you minimally have to separate out behaviors, identities, and desires, and those are like not the same thing. And also look at where the data came from, and what countries, what contexts, what time periods, who's able to speak out, who's not, and to assume that this is about the gay gene as such is really complicated, and to also think that there are going to be similar dynamics around the relationship of behaviors, identities, and desires stratified by different permutations of gender identities, let alone race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic position. And I do not know enough to know how the paper has dealt with those. But I think the thing is that obviously anything we do as living creatures has components of our biology in it, and it has components of our society in it.
And you may as well ask, to what extent is quote unquote straight people's quote unquote behaviors genetically determined? What does that get you? And if anyone thinks there are simple political answers to these questions, that there are some who will argue, just to be very clear in the debates, that if you say quote unquote it's genetic, whatever that means, which is obviously beyond simplistic as a frame, some people will say, great, let's euthanize you now. And others, and that was done in Nazi Germany with the the pink triangle. And that the whole idea was to prevent the procreation. And others will say, great, you shouldn't be treated again. You shouldn't be discriminated against because you have something that looks like an illness. It's like, well, that's really helpful. Thanks a lot for sharing. And then there will be others that will say, let's actually look at the extraordinary diversity of sexual behaviors, not only amongst humans, but lots of other species. And I don't know if you saw, but there was just recently, as yet another example, I've been tracking these, they've been trotted out over the past 15 years, of another gay penguin couple. And there's a new one in Australia that happened, which is now, they're like these two guys that have, duly courted each other and are now raising a little penguin egg. And they're proving to be, as the article is demonstrating, the best behaved parents yet of any compared to the quote unquote heterosexual penguins. And this happened at the same time as debates in Australia about the gay marriage referendum. And at one level, it's ludicrous. At the other level, this is where the state of discourse. So epidemiologists need to know that they walk into this and need to walk into understanding the complexities and to do anything that would suggest a simplistic certainty about causes of anything this complex. That's by itself unethical and bad science.
Great. So sort of building on from that, the last question I wanted to ask is about the idea of well-defined interventions, because I think that people would be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. And from my perspective, I think, if we're trying to understand a causal mechanism, then we need to ask a specific, well-defined question so that we can hone in on some mechanism. But I agree that that's not always our goal, and sometimes we just want to describe what's going on. And I think you laid out a really good argument that, even the mechanism is not enough to understand why the disease is distributed. And in the causal methods, that's sort of something that's being worked on a lot lately with external validity and transportability. And a lot of people are thinking about how do we take what we learn about one mechanism and think about it in other populations. So I think the sort of question is, when we start thinking about some of these really complicated social epi questions about race and racism and social position and things like this, what is that sort of trade-off? How do we ask questions that help us do something or learn something, and how should we be thinking about those trade-offs, and what are your thoughts?
So the first start with a question like that always, Ellie, is asking who's the we in that sentence, because there's a lot of we's at play of who has to do what, and that's what ecosocial theory also helps you ask more explicitly. So there is a job of epidemiologists in producing certain kinds of knowledge. Epidemiologists sometimes can be parts of teams that are making policy recommendations, or can be sometimes parts of teams that are implementing interventions and evaluating them, but not always. There are a lot of things that happen that have no input from epidemiologists whatsoever that are policies. One can look at, for example, most economic policies, which have health impacts that are never considered anything that needs to be legally formally assessed, even though you will see that there are impact assessment criteria that would need to be made for environmental policies. So there's always a question of the we, and epidemiologists understanding that as a field, we are but one contributor to the complex phenomena that are shaping population health, sometimes consciously and deliberately as per the work of health policies and the work of health departments, whether federal, state, or local, sometimes because of particular studies that are really trying consciously to do a certain kind of intervention. Sometimes we are in the position where we can help evaluate what's happened in the real world where there was not conscious planning, but certainly that just because there wasn't conscious planning doesn't mean there's not lots of consequences, right? And so there's lots that needs to get looked at in that, and making judicious choices as to where one wants to make an impact, where it would be helpful to have an answer, and helpful to whom? Helpful to the community advocates, helpful to the lawyers that are filing lawsuits about one kind of environmental exposure or another, helpful to legislators. I mean, there's lots of different potential audiences. So there's never going to be one simple answer to that question. There is going to be trying to judiciously look, where is there an important gap in knowledge that would be helpful to fill, that would be useful as a policy lever, as a place to understand you might want to communicate with people that are fighting against this particular disease or exposure, that it would be helpful to know this, that you need to replicate studies, because one of the key things about science is not one-off studies, but actually repeated replicable results, that the originality can sometimes come from understanding how you can come up with another study that bolsters the evidence, that leads to a deeper understanding of the causal mechanisms at play, but everything is not a one-off study. So that requires knowing what you need to do for TB and malaria compared to what you need to do for methane gas increases, given like new policies to potentially change that around, what's happening with the exposures around fracking. There's going to be so many different kinds of levels of uncertainty and differences in gaps in knowledge. So there's not one easy answer. There is, however, having humility, which is that the epidemiologist and epidemiologic evidence is just one piece of the picture, never suggesting that it is the full picture, and understanding then with whom is one engaged as an epidemiologist to better figure out what would be useful research. Some of that research may be directly useful. You get this all the time in it, figuring out your IRB stuff. Will it be directly useful to the people in the study? Usually not. Will it be potentially beneficial to the quote-unquote population overall? One hopes so. How do you go from making that a hope to an actuality? So there's not going to be an answer there. I think a key thing, getting back to the very first question at the beginning, is that understanding effectiveness of when you give a group of people a particular pill and or a particular procedure in a very short time frame is really, really different than most of the stuff that drives population health. It's very important because clinical treatment matters if you're sick, blah, blah, blah. But that said, that's going to give you a very different understanding of what constitutes a quote-unquote well-defined intervention. And any claim that studies should not be done if they cannot come up with a well-defined intervention, let's say I want to change who's president of the United States. That could be a very well-defined intervention. Am I, as an epidemiologist, going to be the person that does that? No. In terms of the impacts on health policies. Can I think about that? Absolutely. And finally, so if you want me to say that's a well-defined intervention, yeah, that's why we have elections. But that's a way more complicated, messy thing than just saying an epidemiologist is going to create that intervention. So that's important to keep that in mind. The second thing is that there absolutely does need to be room for descriptive work, which is particularly following trends and following with an eye to health equity. So, for example, a big study just got published. Now the UK is quote-unquote caught up to the US in having stagnation and differential by class of life expectancy. They haven't had that. We had our running in that, interrupted a few years ago. They've just come out with new results about that. There was a very big article in The Guardian that came out 2 days about that. That's really core. Now, there's a colleague of mine who's quoted in that who was actually first paying an eye, looking at that in certain specific cities in the UK and saying, how come this isn't getting attention? It's just seen as boring vital statistics. It's hello, this is the fundamental measurement of the health of the population. What's going on here? Having declines in life expectancy? That's a big no-no. What's going wrong? And then you will have the usual sets of immediate arguments. Is it austerity? No, it's people behaving badly. And that gets back to understand those arguments is getting back to the kinds of theories that are discussed in my book.
Great. Thank you. So I think, how do people in the audience feel about asking questions? Matt, do you have a question?
I have lots.
On recording or off recording?
No, I'm happy.
Okay.
Say your name.
Matt Fox. Do I have to say where? You know where? So first of all, thank you for both writing this book and engaging with us on this. This is really interesting. And I have to say, I went into this slightly skeptical that I needed to read this book, and I've come away from this really having gotten a ton out of it, and I very much appreciate that. And one of the things that I did not expect, but one of the things that it's really forced me to do is to think a lot about the definition of epidemiology. The definition that I sort of have stuck in my head is study of the distribution and determinants of diseases in human populations and the application of that knowledge to the control of disease. And I always thought of that as a list of things that we do. And what your book is making me think, and what I want to get your reaction to, is it made me think that it's sort of much more of a feedback loop, that we study distributions in part to think about what the determinants are, but we study determinants. There are determinants of those distributions, and It seems to me it's much more of a process rather than a set of different things that we do. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
First, I'm very glad to hear that the book gave you some new things to think about. That's always the intent, writing, but you never know until you actually find out. I mean, yes, I teach students, but that's a little different talking to people that are reading it who are not specifically the students I teach. Secondly, like any field, the work is meant to feed on itself and contribute something new. So there will be feedback loops. Third, I think where epidemiology is, what I mean by it being a reflexive science, is it's one where we do have an obligation to have our results make a difference in the real world. And that's partly because we're in public health. And that's not the same as a purely theoretical science. So that's going to be that will be built into the definition also. And that's a part of the definition to hold on to. But absolutely, they do feed to each other. And I think that much more understanding of determinants leading to the kinds of exposures, leading kind of the changes in population health, and having that very dynamic view, dynamic not only in the life course, but in historical generations. That's how we see. We have to think in multiple temporal scales to understand population health. And if the definition and your thinking of feedback loops is part of what helps you see that more clearly, that's a very happy thing.
So I'm Bob Horsford, also from BU. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I'm certainly guilty of spending a lot of time looking at the biomedical model. But I did, as I was reading the book, think that one of the things that seems to be a way to frame many of the social factors is similar to herd immunity, which is something that you can't measure in the individual. You can only measure it if you measure it in the community. And I'm wondering if that is a way to conceptualize things that we'd like to measure in the community that in fact affect the outcomes of individuals.
So, I mean, yes, a lot of people in social epi do refer to the herd immunity idea. And that is, but the thing is that the herd immunity, what's a little tricky is that is a contextual measure that arrives in part out of composition. So what you're doing is you're figuring out the N of people that are immune versus not in a given community. There are other kinds of measures that are contextual and structural that can't be reduced to something that can be measured in or on people's bodies. And so that's where herd immunity won't work for those kinds of measures. So when I tell you an economic policy or an educational policy that's affecting health outcomes, you will see the impact of that as it becomes embodied, and you will pick that up as the epidemiologist for your health outcomes, but you won't be able to frame that quite in the same way as herd immunity. Because the herd immunity, but what will be similar in those examples is that in both you need to define what and who constitutes the community, what are the social and spatial boundaries that say who's in it versus not, in order to have something that looks like a numerator and denominator. And so that will also be true when you're saying what's the impact of an educational policy or of an economic policy, who's the N of exposed, who's going to be affected given exposed, blah, blah, blah. So those things will be similar, and none of those can be reduced to the individual level. So there will be multiple levels involved, and herd immunity gives an understanding for one aspect of, but that's again something that becomes a compositional that then has a contextual effect as a result.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So I think that we'll end the recording here, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some more discussion. But I want to thank you again, Dr. Krieger, for coming and talking with us and for recording this so we can share it with Epi Twitter, who's, I think, very much enjoyed reading the book. There's been a lot of great discussion on there. I guess I just maybe close up by asking what your sort of next step recommendation would be for someone who's read this book and now wants to sort of think about reading a next book or a next paper to work more on incorporating theory into their work, if there's...
So one, again, thank you for having me and having this discussion today. And again, it's been for me very edifying. I will now confess that I've been reading what people have been posting, but I do not have a Twitter account, and I will never have a Twitter account. I am deliberately not on social media, but that's a different conversation in this day of like getting hacked and a few other details. But But it's been great for me to actually see how people have engaged and to see what is or isn't useful and to see what are and are not concerns that people express. That's always a great way to learn. So I also really appreciate that opportunity for engagement. I think, again, what I would really, really recommend is to take, just as an exercise, and I always do this, take a theory you hate and try to apply it to the question that you're interested in, as well as take a theory that you hope to actually really use. See what differences that gets you. I mean, that's what the critique paper that I have students write does that. But try saying, here's a given like exposure outcome relationship, or here's an outcome I'm interested in understanding why its distribution is what it is. What kinds of questions would I ask if I used lifestyle? What kinds of questions would I ask if I use political economy of health? What kinds of questions would I ask if I use health and human rights? What kinds of questions would I ask if I use eco-social theory? And actually just like systematically sit down and do that for like an infectious disease outcome, and do that for like infant mortality, and do that for like, I don't know, breast cancer. I mean, things that you care about, whatever do that for psychiatric illness of one form or another. Think about, what's making me think about, is this like humans in general or humans in a particular time and place, and which ones? Try that. That's the next best thing, which is that just like with methods, when you go learn new methods, you don't just like sit and read theory papers about methods. You go, how can I program this? What happens? Where are all the bugs in the program? What went wrong? Do I have any reason to believe these results? Probably not. What went wrong again? You apply them. You apply things to understand how they work and see and test their limits and see if it's good under what circumstances does this work versus not work. So you would do that with any methods that you would do. You would look at validity and reliability studies. You would do that with any statistical methods that you use. You would look at that with regard to study designs and say, I want to study this. What are the right kinds of study designs? Usually there's more than one. What would they give you as different purchase to answer the questions? But this is saying, step back. What are the questions you're asking? Let's think about how those would connect to what the theories of disease distribution are, and just try it out. And that would really be like, if people could conscientiously do that as an exercise, that would be a very good thing.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. We can see if we can pick a paper or a topic on Twitter and try to have people work through that. That would be really cool.
And as I said, what I do with my students consistently, and in this course, because I also have one section that's actually per infectious disease, that's only a list of papers on tuberculosis. And they're meant to be good papers. And say, okay, what's the theory of disease distribution or theories that underlie this paper? And they see the completely different kinds of things that are out there in the real world and the real journals to say, okay, they didn't ask about this because they wouldn't think about that because their theory probably didn't tell them. And then also to see how many of those papers actually bothered to say in somewhere in the introduction, we are using this theory of disease distribution. Typically, you're not far off if you guess the answer is 0.
I can believe it. Okay, so thank you very much again for coming and speaking with us, and for the book, which I think everybody seemed to really enjoy. So it's been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.